Gus Hosein worries about data, everyone's data. As executive director of Privacy International, Gus has a long history of fighting to protect people's data from exploitation by companies and governments.
When the Bush administration introduced the U.S. visit system, we were the only organization on the planet that opposed it, saying this is ridiculous. You shouldn't be fingerprinting kids coming to visit people in the U.S. But Americans didn't really care. Although it was funny because at that time, the Brazilians were a little bit rebellious, and they decided to retaliate against Americans by fingerprinting all American visitors. And Colin Powell was Secretary of State at the time, and he was on his way to Brazil. And when he was asked about that, he said he was going to make his displeasure clear to the Brazilians that that was not a good practice. He couldn't even imagine that this was standard U.S. policy. And I was working at the time campaigning against that system, and the Japanese government had also introduced its equivalent system. And the EU was very much on our side, saying, no, you should not be collecting data on EU citizens who are just visiting the U.S. And the data collected in the U.S. visit system, the fingerprint data is kept for 100 years.
Welcome back to another episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm John Lebkowski, and my partners in crime there are Scoop Sweeney and Wendy Grossman. And today we're going to be interviewing Gus Hosein, who is the Executive Director of Privacy International, which is a London-based charity that works across the world to protect people and their data from exploitation by governments and companies. I'm not sure which is worse. He's worked at the intersection of tech and human rights for over 25 years and will have a lot to say, I'm sure. Welcome, Gus.
Thank you for having me.
I'm keeping my mouth shut. I thought Wendy was going to ask the first question.
Oh, okay. Do you want to give us an idea of what you see as the trajectory of privacy over the last 25 years? I mean, in a couple of sentences, right? No, but I mean, the
25 words or less.
I mean, there's certain things you look at, that 25 years ago, we were more concerned about governments and less concerned. There weren't giant technology companies. And if there were, it was Microsoft and IBM. I mean, and the sense in which we didn't quite have such rapacious companies trying to make everything to suit them. So, I mean,
maybe it's the Christmas season, which is why I'm a little bit more optimistic than that, because when I got into this in the mid 90s, you didn't have Google, but you had AT&T, you had telephone companies getting into bed with governments all the time. And you had a complete lack of clarity what was going on. The NSA was still unknown to most people as the National Security Agency. The British equivalent, you couldn't even speak about. And
today I have one of their mugs on my table.
Exactly. At PI's Christmas party for Secret Santa, one of the gifts going around was GCHQ's annual puzzle book. It's the ball has moved so much further. And just talking about privacy in the 1990s, when people asked what you did for a living, if you mentioned you worked on privacy, they'd have no idea what you're doing. And now it's so much more advanced, so much more sophisticated, so much more exciting and optimistic. You can't go through the news any given day without running into stories about our issues. Whereas in the 1990s, it was only occasionally, and it was usually about caller ID. So I think it's been a fantastic trajectory.
I think you have a point there, because when I think about it, it's a long time since I had to explain to somebody that everybody has secrets. And my usual thing was, if they say, well, I have nothing to hide, you'd sort of say, well, great. Do you want to get your bank statements on the backs of postcards?
Yeah. I haven't had that question for a very long time. And it's wonderful to not get that question, because I never had a good answer.
Well, that was my answer.
Well, I was thinking about something that was an issue and something we really discussed quite a bit in I guess mid to late 90s, we started talking about how people should have ownership of their own data. And there was actually a project for that called Platform for Privacy Preferences, or P3P, which is obsolete now, but for a while they worked on it. And the idea was that you could store your privacy preferences in the browser, and whoever you connected with would read those preferences and act accordingly. And I'm just kind of wondering whether people are still thinking about, is it still a thought anywhere that I should own my own data and that I should be able to bargain with my own data?
Every now and then that idea reemerges with another company that has that idea of creating this this highly secure stash that you're in complete control of, that you can trade and share accordingly. It's there are two obstacles to it. First, I guess there's the human rights framework, which is, if you treat data as property, that means you can actually sell it. That means it can be traded once you've sold it, and you've lost control of it, actually. Whereas the human rights framework says no matter where your data is and who has possession of it is still yours, in the sense that you still have the right over that data. And I guess the second reason it never quite takes off is because it's about the data you think you have control over. Oh, it's your health data. So when you go and get a test, and you store that data in a store, but actually the health provider has a copy of that data, and they're actually in control of that data, and they're sharing it as they see fit. And if it was a company for profit or insurance company, and then all of a sudden our idea of what is ours and what's under our control and what's under our possession, we quickly realized that actually very little of it is under our control and very little of it is under our possession. So it's impossible to actually have this wonderful stash put somewhere very secure that you're in control of, when in reality, Wendy's giving away my data all the time. And even on this call, my data is flowing all over the place beyond the control of any of us. That's the modern reality, unfortunately.
Do you see personal data stores as kind of the latest iteration of that particular desire to own data and control it?
That's exactly what I see it as. Yeah, and it's at the heart of it is a good intent, which is you should be in control. You really should be able to say when and how and where your data goes. And it's a sad statement that you don't have that control, but it's also it's the reality of the world that you never really had that level of control. It's kind of like when people in Britain woke up and said, "Oh my God, we have to get out of the EU. We got to take back control." They never had control to begin with, and that's the control is the myth. What you want is and this sounds a little too statist, but you want a governance framework. You want the idea that your data can be anywhere, but you still have an element of you have rights over it still.
You know, one of the things that's always struck me as the fundamental problem that computers have brought is that in the physical media, in the physical era, in the analog era, what was expensive was making copies and distributing data. And in this era, what's expensive is curating data and deleting things and selecting data. And that is a fundamental reversal that I think it's really hard to get past.
Absolutely. And I actually wonder with LLMs, what old and garbage data means to those systems that are constantly learning. It is, and actually, is it, if you think about why everybody's excited about LLMs and as a replacement to Google, is that when you now do a Google search, you get so much garbage. It's actually not useful to you as much as it used to be. And so this era of, as you say, ever accumulating data and the difficulty of actually curating it has led to this moment.
Personally, I divorced Google in 2010, but I know what you mean.
Yeah.
DuckDuckGo so far has not decided to adopt AI.
Yeah, although they're run by, like, they're essentially Bing. And Bing's integration with ChatGPT is quite a thing to watch.
Yeah, I'm actually in the market for a new search engine but that's not a privacy issue. So,
No.
or
that's very meta to be searching for a search
issue.
engine.
Searching for a search engine in all the wrong places.
Before we started this talk, I actually asked one of I think it was Bard, to feed me a set of questions as a backup, and they were pretty good questions. And I've tried that before. They're never really right. They're a little bit too general. They're not really very useful as questions, but they are pretty useful as prep. It's just kind of getting you to think about the things that you're going to want to talk about.
Yeah, so we were testing it out at the PI office. We were testing it out a few months ago. About we asked ChatGPT to generate a press release for what would Privacy International say about the tracking of asylum seekers. And of course, Wendy, the journalist, would yell at me for even talking about a press release, because press releases are useless. But getting my colleagues to write a good press release is hard.
They're not always useless.
The AI wrote a really good press release. It was well formatted. It was succinct. It was interesting, and it had our voice. It really captured the way that we would have said things.
One of the big problems I hear about AI is it's a tool of expropriating other people's work with no credit and no compensation, especially to artists, performers, famous folks suddenly find themselves sucked up into the AI and distributed in a totally inappropriate manner. You're seeing already in our elections phony endorsements by famous folk who didn't do the endorsement. How in the world can we cope with that and not do away with AI, but it needs some controls of some sort?
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. We did we have our own podcast, and we did a whole edition based on that story that came out of Arizona, if I recall correctly, about a mother getting a phone call from her daughter saying she was kidnapped, but basically it was all AI generated based on very little amount of voice data, and how extraordinary that is. And the idea that you have any control over your voice or your face or any of your content that once it goes into the AI systems, it's all over. But the other side of it, there's an interest in making sure you are part of that. It's I got approached by a number of UK-based human rights organizations, and they were asking, how are you navigating the AI in the workplace kind of situation? And they were all talking about banning it. Whereas I was taking the approach that we shouldn't be using it. We shouldn't be drafting press releases using AI, but we should make sure that we're feeding them. We're making sure that when somebody asks a question, what are the issues with facial recognition at protests? We want to make sure our content is what's feeding the answer, rather than just law enforcement content feeding the answer. So if it is the arbiter of what is fact and what is truth going forward, we need to make sure the right things get in there.
What would be the difference between the way you would answer that question and the way law enforcement would answer it? What are you trying to kind of...
I would hope it'd be very similar, but we tend to dig beneath the surface a little bit more about whether or not this technology works, whether or not this technology has a legal basis, whether or not this technology should have been created in the first place. So, like, for instance, Privacy International took one of the first legal cases against a facial recognition company called Clearview AI. We filed complaints in 5 jurisdictions across Europe, including the UK, Italy, and France. And we got tens of millions of euros of fines against the company because the company was scraping photos from social media. And the idea that they should be allowed to scrape photos from social media to then build a system that they then provide access to law enforcement is unacceptable. But a law enforcement description of it would be, we use this technology to only detect criminals, and it's only used in very specific circumstances. Our answer is that technology shouldn't exist in the first place. And fortunately, the law is on our side.
That kind of reminds me. When I was researching Privacy International before the podcast, I realized that there's some similarities to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And when the Electronic Frontier Foundation was founded, it was primarily because they realized that people who make policy and people who enforce policy or do law enforcement were not going to understand the technologies at all, and they were going to make bad policy. They're going to do a bad job of law enforcement because of that lack of understanding. So that's really what EFF was founded for.
Yeah,
and it sounds like Privacy International does some of that.
Yeah, I loved your storytelling about the history of everything, and then the inclusion of the EFF story, because PI was founded at the exact same time as EFF. We were in 1990 as well, where EFF came out of questions around copyright and government surveillance in the form of like Fourth Amendment and updating the Fourth Amendment.
On hacking.
And
hacking too.
PI came out of the pushback against government ID systems. The idea that whether it was first in Australia, the idea that the government could issue an ID card. But then what was interesting was to see how the idea of issuing new ID cards based on new databases started traveling around the Pacific region. So it went to New Zealand, went to Thailand, and we were finding the companies were the ones spreading the idea. And so that's where PI got in slightly differently to EFF, where we, from the earliest of stages, we were identifying that companies and government were the threats to privacy. And going to how you opened this entire conversation, which is worse, governments or companies. Actually, the worst is when they work together, the collusion. And I think that's where PI's story has remained consistent over all these years, whereas EFF has it had its Washington moment, and now it has its current phase, and it's more people-oriented campaigning. PI's always stuck to this line of governments and companies can be problematic, and they're even worse when they're brought together.
Yeah, they're kind of like a law firm now too. They actually have lawyers who argue cases.
But, yeah, and that's happening in our sector a lot. And I have to constantly resist our own lawyers, and we have a lot of lawyers. It basically just became easier at one point to take a legal case than to fight for public opinion, than to fight in legislatures. I remember in one country, we were trying to fight against a law that was going through its parliament, and we were trying to enlist the help of the main human rights organization in the country. And they couldn't care less, because they knew they would have more fun litigating the law after it become law rather than trying to stop it. And it seems to be a very strong temptation now within the human rights community and the civil liberties community and the tech rights community, just to get the lawyers busy.
Well, actually trying to get legislation and actually lobbying, that's sort of like taking on a very dirty plumbing job, isn't it? It's like you kind of have to wade into the cesspool and try to figure out a way to maneuver.
Yeah, well, that's if you take democracy seriously, that's what you got to do. It's horrible. It's long. It's painful. It's that whole sausage analogy is entirely accurate. You really don't want to see it up close, but if that's where you have the real debate. That's where you have the conflict of ideas. The problem with once you and don't get me wrong, we have won many cases in courts. I'm very proud of all the legal cases we've taken, but it is based on this huge assumption that governments will pay attention to what a court says, and they do not. The number of cases we've won where we're still waiting for implementation, but at least you have this moment where you
more
can
in the
wave
US
placards and say we won. Well, and the same in the US.
Is that something that's getting worse in the UK? I mean, it seems to me like 25, 30 years ago when I was first living here, governments actually did listen more, in public consultations, in decisions of courts, in demonstrations. I mean, there's been this trend.
I wonder.
Seems to me like in the last 30 years, there's been a distinct trend towards just ignoring what everybody says.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder though if it's because we've been paying attention to the courts for the last 30 years. And it's not just the UK. It's like there's a policy called data retention, which was actually a Bush administration idea, which was to force telephone companies and ISPs to retain the transactional data, the metadata of everybody's usage. AT&T did this all the time. And there was no legal requirement for them to stop doing so. But any country that has data protection law, there's a requirement that once data is no longer required, it has to be deleted. After 9/11, the Bush administration, Bush wrote a letter to EU government saying, please introduce data retention laws in order to fight terrorism. And so governments introduced these laws, and we took cases over, a 13-year period where every time we took a case on data retention to any court, we would win, but we'd have to take it back again and again and again. And there's still data retention across the European Union. Well, it's extraordinary how they just ignore, or they play a longer game than we can. And we don't have a budget for this type of stuff.
Well, in this country, in the U.S., the courts have taken a nasty turn because, I mean, you have a lot of good jurists out there who are making reasoned decisions, and we have a Supreme Court that has abandoned reason in favor of right-wing politics, and that's exactly what's happened. And so it's gotten to the point where you really can't rely upon the courts because you may get a few good decisions, but in the end, it can go horribly wrong. Do you see that happening in other countries, or are we kind of the Lone Ranger of bad decisions?
No, it's indeed happening, and even when I'm not a lawyer. I just play one at work because I employ a lot of lawyers, and they don't plan well enough for what happens when a court goes wrong. And deference to the executive it plagues every judiciary, every single one of them, particularly on the issues that we care about. The moment national security is involved, often courts will say they have no jurisdiction whatsoever. And it takes an extraordinarily brave and often liberal judge to say, we can even hear this case. And so, yeah, while the Supreme Court in the U.S. has been definitely turning on issues of social and economic rights, for sure, on the issues of national security and terrorism, courts around the world have been relatively hard, let's say. I don't want to be mean because we have to go before them and hope they listen to us.
Well, it is. I mean, it's kind of a scary time. The other problem that we have here is that we have people who increasingly feel that they can just ignore the laws. They're just going to blow the laws off. And there was a poll recently that showed a significant number of people who believed that a leader, thinking of Trump, of course, should ignore laws. And kind of like what it is that it's a problem with democracy. People, I mean, you talk about how messy democracy is. People don't want the mess of democracy. So they want to just put somebody there who will make decisions and enforce the decisions themselves, and the hell with the laws. And I'm afraid that that's becoming pretty widespread. What are you seeing?
Well, it's all linked to the fact that things are getting so much more damn complicated now. And that's why this idea of take back control or government should get out of the way because it was easier back then, or red tape is interfering with everything. Yeah, I get all of those sentiments. Equally, though, the very people who claim the red tape is getting in the way, they're the ones interested in putting more red tape in to defend what it is they want. And again, I work in the area of national security and anti-terrorism, or back during the COVID pandemic, I worked on, well, those issues. And governments want, it's ideological free, that governments just want. And they will use any political punchline or any political line they can to get what they want. So yeah, they'll pull out a Trumpian logic at one moment in time, and then try to say that it's the great duty of the state to protect its people. It's cynical. It's what it is. But it actually goes back to something you were saying just before. Like, we took a case about 6 years ago. It took 4 years to get through the courts in the UK about whether or not MI5, which is the domestic intelligence agency in Britain, which, to me as an American, the thought that there's a domestic intelligence agency in a country kind of blows one's mind. But MI5 was ignoring legal safeguards. And they were also telling their own bosses in government that they were ignoring legal safeguards. And the court had to eventually agree with us that yes, MI5 had actually not been candid enough with the court, was ignoring legal safeguards. And we thought, okay, that's great, we won. And the next day, the boss within the government, the equivalent of the attorney general, just said, yeah, well, they're sorry, but let's move on. And that's no wonder why people are cynical. We've gotten lazy when it comes to controlling the executive power of the state. And maybe for a moment there with Trump, or the post-Trump moment, you think America would push back against the Cheney view of the world, which is you need a strong executive. We must have rules around our strong leaders, because we should be afraid of the day that people want strong leaders who can get away with it. But we haven't done that yet.
Our own version of MI5, the FBI, has a pretty checkered history of ignoring the boundaries and the laws governing what it can and can't do. So it's not like you guys were experiencing something totally unique. Yeah, it's that temptation when you have a lot of power to go in and just use it no matter what. And you see that going in kind of waves. You'll get some cleanups done. When it gets totally out of control, they have to clean up their house, and then they slowly creep back into the bad practices.
Yeah, it's like the Church Commission in the 1970s, and then the Snowden moment in the early 2010s. But then they'll disappear back into the darkness and try to get away with it all over again. Absolutely, and that's why it's particularly hard to do what we do, because we can't wait every 30 years for somebody to come forward and say, oh, this should be bad. These people be up to no good. We have to presume that that's the case and keep on digging. But courts will time and again say, oh, we have no jurisdiction here. We can't look into an intelligence agency. That belongs under UK law. The intelligence agency is under the purview essentially of the king and the powers of the king.
Years ago, the Americans may not necessarily be familiar with Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, but it was a sitcom that actually explained to Britain how their government worked. It sort of focused on the war between the civil service and the ever-changing ministers in charge. And the guy who wrote it was a guy named Anthony, well, one of the two writers was Anthony Jay, who wrote a book called Management and Machiavelli. And the reason the show is so enduringly accurate is that he had a very deep understanding of how large organizations work. He died about 10 years ago, and shortly before that, one of our friends introduced me to him because he regarded him as a career mentor. This was William Heath. And I asked him at the time, I think the big question was, I forget what it was we were trying to defeat at the time. But I remember asking him, do we stand a chance? And he basically said no. Large organizations always want as much, to them, information is power. They always want as much of it as they can get, and they are never going to cede any of it, And it was kind of depressing to hear, but, I would imagine that he was absolutely right. I mean, he did understand how those things work.
Yeah, just bringing that example to a story I read just last week about how the FBI, and it might be other police forces in the US, have access to Israeli intelligence. So, who the Israeli government's identifying as problematic is shared in bulk with US authorities. And so US authorities now have a list of names generated by a foreign government under reasons that can never quite be understood sufficiently with the necessary nuance in the context, and is going to be used in domestic policing here. And that's what we found in the Snowden moment. It wasn't just that the US government was getting away with collecting vast amounts of data, or the UK government was getting away with collecting vast amounts of data. It was that they were sharing this data en masse with each other and with other governments around the world. And so you get to the point where not only governments collecting huge amounts, but they're just in this business of constantly trading on this data. So yeah, going back to John's earlier point, I wish there was a company I could sign up with that would take possession of my data and make sure that only I have control over it. But you're not going to stop the Israelis, you're not going to stop the Russians, you're not going to stop the Australians, and the constant flow of information amongst them that will feed airline security systems, will feed protest surveillance systems in city squares, and will feed employment decisions at some point.
Yeah, there was a story today. There was a story today that the EU is going to start requiring fingerprints and facial scans from British people traveling to the EU next year, and I think that's going to be a real shock to a lot of the British people. I don't think anybody's is prepared for that.
Well, I hope the Americans are shocked by it. This is what pisses me off. When the Bush administration introduced the US visit system, we were the only organization on the planet that opposed it, saying this is ridiculous. You shouldn't be fingerprinting kids coming to visit people in the US. But Americans didn't really care. Although it was funny because at that time, the Brazilians were a little bit rebellious, and they decided to retaliate against Americans by fingerprinting all American visitors. And Colin Powell was Secretary of State at the time, and he was on his way to Brazil. And when he was asked about that, he said he was going to make his displeasure clear to the Brazilians that that was not a good practice. He couldn't even imagine that this was standard US policy. And I was working at the time campaigning against that system, and the Japanese government had also introduced its equivalent system. And the EU was very much on our side, saying, no, you should not be collecting data on EU citizens who are just visiting the US. And the data collected in the US visit system, the fingerprint data is kept for 100 years. And it's like, why is a 13-year-old being fingerprinted at the border and having her data kept for 100 years? It's because it's the FBI standards on collection of fingerprints. So yeah, the EU started to do it 20 years later because it's taken them a long time to first get over their revulsion and then realize that they could have fun collecting data as well, passing the law. And then there's about 7 years late because building the tech is actually quite hard and it's going to fail.
Also, Brexit.
Do we have a widespread, like global, clearly defined set of rights around information? I mean, do we know what rights we should be trying to protect globally with a high degree of clarity, and how to do that?
Yes. And we've known it since the 1970s, and it was actually developed by the US government. It was HHS actually that developed these principles that everybody should have the ability to have some control over their data. And other governments, when they saw this great US government report on how to respond to the rise of databases, other governments said, okay, fine, we're going to put that into law. And the Germans were the first, then the French, and then the English. And then before you knew it, every EU country had to have this law, what we call data protection law. And now it's over 120 countries across the world. A lot of African countries, almost all of Asia. India just finally got its data protection law last month. So billions of people are protected to some degree under law. The only one that is missing from that list, even China, yeah. The only one missing from that list is the US. And it's because for the last 30 years, there's been essentially congressional impasse at the same time as the rise of Silicon Valley companies who have made money off collecting data. So there's a huge resistance to giving Americans this very same rights that everybody else on the planet practically has.
Well, the
Data is the new oil, as they say.
The U.S. government has a good history of sanctioning all the Russian oligarchs, but has a very poor track record when it comes to their own oligarchs, the holy trinity of Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Musk. They seem to be able to get away with doing whatever they feel like with their data, our data, anybody's data. And I don't see there being any attempt to slow that down.
Yeah, like, sorry, Wendy, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Musk isn't particularly a data hog, is he, though? I mean, it's more Amazon, as you say, Amazon, but also all these shadowy companies behind the scenes that most people don't even know exist.
Yeah, it's the data brokers, like the Experians of the world, well, of America, who are the ones quietly collecting all this data and then selling it onwards. But yeah, Zuckerberg certainly had his moment, the Cambridge Analytica moment that finally caught up and bit him because when in 2013 he said, on top of the fact he said that privacy is a old concept and everybody's moved on. He also created this social layer, essentially saying that data accumulated on Facebook should be just accessible to other companies. And at the time, everybody thought, well, isn't he clever? Because he was going through this hero moment, the same hero moment that Musk went through up until a couple of years ago. And now we're seeing it with Sam Altman. For some reason, and I'm not sure it's just Americans that suffer from this disease, but needing to believe that there's these great industrialists who know best because they're terribly bright and terribly white and terribly educated. It's a sickness, and we're repeating it time and again. Like, I don't know if the same thing happened to you, but many journalists lost their Thanksgiving this year because of the whole drama around what was going on with OpenAI. And it's because we wanted to be part of this drama. We couldn't imagine how this great Sam Altman that everybody said was the Oppenheimer of our times, he lost his job, probably for being a bit of an ass or being unregulatable by his own board. And we got so caught up in this drama. And then, all 700 staff or 700 out of 770 staff threatened to quit, even though they'd only been working for the company for less than a year, because they couldn't imagine not working for this godlike character, which is what Zuckerberg was 15 years ago. And why do we think this story is going to end any differently?
One of my friends always says that if Facebook described accurately what you were doing when you opened an account or added a friend, you're adding a line to a database, you're adding a line to a spreadsheet. I mean, that people would think about it very differently than they do now.
Yeah, I know, and that's why I was listening to the previous podcast about the story of the internet, and it's all the rights that we were fighting for in the 1990s and the free flow of data and protection of people within that environment. We didn't think we were doing it so that a Bezos and a Zuckerberg can be the beneficiary of all that hard work. But that's what happened. It's
one of the things that we kind of overlooked, I think Lena Khan, who is now the head of the FTC, really made this point in the paper that made her name on Amazon, which is that because companies like IBM were dethroned by a couple of guys in a garage writing an operating system, and because the resulting company, Microsoft, was dethroned by a couple of guys in a garage writing a web browser, writing a search engine, and so forth, there was this belief that it didn't matter. You didn't need to regulate the competition of markets because a new technology would come along built by a couple of guys in a garage and would upend whatever company seemed to be in charge. And her point in the paper was that this is no longer possible because Amazon, Google, these companies have so much money that they can buy their startup competitors before they get too far off the ground, like Facebook did with WhatsApp and with Instagram.
Yeah, and that's why we were proud. So we've been trying to get competition regulators for a number of years to start paying attention to data as the competitive advantage, and particularly in mergers to ask to what degree is the accumulation of data part of the objective of domination. And we've been fortunate to get some competition regulators to buy into that, so much so that we managed to get the UK competition regulator to force the demerger of Facebook and Giphy. And we currently are, we tried the same thing with the EU the EU itself, when it came to Google buying Fitbit. We were arguing that they were ultimately buying the data and the future dominion over the data of Fitbit users. And while we were able to get an investigation to go to a really, really late stage, we didn't get the desirable outcome. But now we're involved in a similar level case at the EU around Amazon buying Roomba, the vacuum, essentially what's the name of the company? Sorry, I forget the name of the company.
iRobot.
iRobot, that's it.
The one that I thought was really awful was, I mean, Facebook bought Instagram and lied, as far as I can tell, to the European Union investigators and said, "Oh no, we're never going to link the databases," and then of course they have.
And the lesson from that came from Google buying DoubleClick back in the early 2000s.
Oh God, yes, we were also we were all opposed to that.
Yeah, and so why do we believe these people, and why do we think they can make these fake assurances that they'll go back upon? And it's because they have more lawyers.
Well, I mean, do we believe them? How widely believed are they at this point? I think there's a bit of a backlash forming.
Yes, I want to believe that, and I do see it, but there's a backlash forming. Then you see how OpenAI has its moment of being the darling of everybody, and it's unthinkable that they could ever do something wrong. And I remember post 9/11, the working on these issues was hard, and you'd get hate mail, but you'd also get far more love than hate mail, until the day we decided to say that Google was wrong to accumulate Wi-Fi data as they were driving around the Street View cars. And we also said it was wrong around that exact same time that Gmail should give you a gigabyte worth of data storage in exchange for being able to scan the content of your messages in order to give you advertisement. We got hate mail like you wouldn't believe for daring to say something against Google. That, like, you say something bad about the Bush administration around the response to 9/11, you get a little bit of hate mail. You go after Google, oh my God, it was like the floodgates had opened of hate mail. And you'd even find that to fund a charity that works on these issues, I have to work with foundations, like very rich institutions that give you money. Back then, if we were targeting Google, those foundations wouldn't talk to you because Google was on the side of angels. And I'm worried around this AI moment. There's this thing happening again, which is there are good companies and there are bad companies.
Google's people have changed about Google, though.
How long? Yeah, how long, and how much hate mail am I going to get apologies for?
I know, but at Google's 10th anniversary, I was called into some radio show and I was asked, will people ever hate Google the way they hate Microsoft? And at the time, it was quite reasonable to say, well, probably not, because Google brings you things that you want, whereas Microsoft Windows crashes, and the user experience is really difficult. But that was before it became impossible to find what you were looking for on Google.
That's the reason Google lost its halo, because its search engine basically started sucking.
Yeah, but now they built in an AI and they'll tell you everything. They'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know about your search term.
Yeah, we have a technology that's gathering data that is very problematic, and it's license plate reader technology. I don't know if that's made it over into the UK, but it's become a real problem.
It was invented here.
Oh,
in the 1990s.
Thanks a lot.
In the 1990s, I was taken on a press trip to a place called Roke Manor, which is a research institution, and they showed us the work they were doing on automatic number plate recognition. And then the UK, then London installed it as part of the congestion charge. I think it was the first, wasn't that the first implementation in the world, Gus?
At that scale, yes. And now there's a national system in the UK that monitors license plates and number plates across the country. And it's actually run by the world's fourth largest defense firm. So it's this isn't some gentle, startup that's running the national surveillance system. It's this is now the business of the defense industry, and it's not limited to the U.S. It's not limited to the U.K. It's spreading everywhere. And in the UK, Wendy's right. The history of it is predominantly around the congestion charging scheme for London, which is in order to get rid of the amount of traffic in London, they start forcing people to pay £5 a day, let's say $7 a day to $15 a day to drive into London. And what started as a very small central London experience quickly is expanded that the entire region around London is now part of this surveillance system. And again, this all happened in the post 9/11 era. And when we looked at the legal regime around the collection of this data, we noticed that there was a bit of an odd carve out for this data, saying that some elements of data protection law doesn't apply to the data collected by this license plate number plate recognition scheme. And we found out ultimately it's because all the data collected by this scheme in London was being sent to the US, to the US government as well, which kind of blows your mind. Why would the US government want access to all this data? And it's because this is just what they do. And so not only should you be worried about the fact that this is happening in the US and there's the collection of all this data, you should be asking, where's this data going next?
Into an AI, into a learning module, no doubt. And AI is kind of feeling like a hula hoop in some respects, because now every technology that's developed, every digital technology that's developed has some reference to AI because it's become sexy. It's like a marketing term. And it seems a little weird to me because I hear so many people who are deathly afraid of AI, and they think it's actually a terrible thing that people are developing Skynet, which is absurd, but that's what people believe. And at the same time, companies are rushing to call things AI, things that, I suspect there'll be a time when you buy a rake at a hardware store and it's AI enabled.
Everything was nanotechnology for a while.
Exactly.
Your vacuum cleaner has AI in it already, for crying out loud. Yeah, I know.
But at the same time, there is actually a difficult, challenging, sinister aspect to the AI thing, and that is that AI can be used for surveillance, and it can be used very effectively for digesting unimaginable amounts of data and deriving meaning from that data in such a way that it could be immensely helpful, but it could also be frighteningly malicious. Yeah. And I don't know the answer there because it ain't going away, right?
It's almost like in order for it to work, to build the world that people are trying to build, you have to destroy every safeguard we have. So I'll give you an example. And this came to mind because I was listening to a podcast interviewing Mark Andreessen of Netscape fame, and now, the Silicon Valley investor extraordinaire and the visionary extraordinaire that everybody loves. And he's talking about AI and weaponry, and he's a huge fan of AI. He just wants to see AI he doesn't want any controls over AI. He wants, because he imagines, like Wendy was using the example of two guys in a garage. He wants them inventing the next generation of AI. And he was saying that in the future, we should not only weaponize AI in the sense that missiles should be equipped with AI. He said we should only allow weapons that have AI to exist, and non-AI weapons should not, because he somehow believes that these weapons and with AI are better than humans who keep on making mistakes. And it takes me back to I don't know if you remember this story, in the days as the US occupation of Afghanistan was ending, and the Taliban was taking over, the Americans were using drones quite a bit, and remote control drones to take out some in retaliation for some attacks. And the New York Times covered this one in detail, where the U.S. government sent a drone and targeted a guy who was driving near a U.S. government building, and they said in the trunk of his car he was carrying explosives, and they killed him and destroyed the car, only to find out that he was actually an aid worker. And that's why he had a data profile that was very much like, I guess, a terrorist, because he was driving around U.S. Government buildings, because he was actually a driver that also did some work for U.S. Aid workers. And everything about his targeting and murder was data led. It was all because his mobile phone had been found at this location, and then it got found at that location, and therefore it's suspicious. And so in the Mark Andreessen view of the world, that was a completely legitimate exercise to take. It's a data-led targeting of a human in a theater of war. Now, Mark Andreessen might say, actually, okay, well, no, the AI wouldn't have made that mistake, because it would have had more data to have access to corroborate. It would have had his identity somehow. And the answer is, well, if you believe in information theory, you'd think that there's a limit to what a system could actually know, but not to these fanboys of AI who just think that the system will always know ultimately what it needs to. But in order for that to happen, you need to destroy every floodgate that exists around the data fed into these systems in order to save the life of a guy who was targeted by a government through a means of automation. It's a bit of a perverse future. So yeah, you kind of need AI to recognize every human being on the planet. And let's not forget that Sam Altman, the wonderful hero of AI right now, one of his side projects is that he's iris scanning the planet. He's behind WorldCoin, which is offering people $40 to show up at a silver orb in city centers across the world and have their eyes scanned to be given, I think it's $40 worth of cryptocurrency. And it was the Kenyan government and the Kenyan data protection regulator to say, no, you can't do this. And in Sam Altman's view, is like, oh, but I'm giving people, control over their identity. It's like, no, you're feeding your systems and you're claiming to give people cryptocurrency in order to help them. That's pretty gross.
One of the great myths that I think is what's pushing all this is that more data is always going to be better data. And the security researcher John Crowcroft and I collaborate every summer on a silly paper for a silly conference called Geeky. And our paper this year was about the reality that what you get is poisoning. And we have an example of it in prior art in the form of Google flu trends, which was this idea that you could see what people were searching for in terms of symptoms, and you could predict where flu was happening. But what happened was, in fact, people start searching for flu symptoms for all sorts of reasons. And so it looked good at first, and then the sort of model kind of collapsed. And that was what we ended up talking about with these large language models, is that they're being used to generate web pages. Which are being fed back into the system. So basically what's happening is the AI is poisoning itself. Yeah. And we're not, we're already less than 6 months after we wrote that, we're already seeing studies come out and say, well, actually, these large language models aren't working as well as they were a few months ago because they're being poisoned by the text that they themselves have generated.
And this is when I feel really old, Wendy, because it's every few years we go through this incredible moment of optimism around data shall save us. And the Google flu trends, I remember that moment because that was when big data was starting to take off, and everybody was referencing, oh, Google's going to save us because of Google flu trends. And I remember The Economist had a front page article around how data is going to save Africa from pandemics.
Oh,
and
I
how
don't remember that.
and
No.
you had telcos, telephone companies in Europe who were fighting to become the next Google because they wanted to monetize their data, but they were being fended off by ridiculous organizations like my own, saying that they shouldn't be holding on to their data. So they were jumping on the bandwagon of, oh, but we can help Africa fight the next pandemic if we're allowed to mine this data. And so the Economist puts it on the front cover because Google flu trends. And this is all a repetition of what had happened, say, 6 years before that, when Admiral Poindexter comes up with the crazy idea that in order to fight the
Total
war,
information awareness.
we need total information awareness in the US, where you can accumulate a lot of data and identify all the bad people.
The thing I hated most during the mad more data is better data was the insistence that if you had enough data, you no longer needed to show causality, and you didn't need to pay any attention to traditional science and forming a hypothesis and testing it, because all you had to do was look at these giant piles of data and these patterns would emerge that no human would see otherwise.
Yep. We're doing it
I found
all
it
over
really
again.
offensive.
Yeah.
Well, the data is subject to decay, and the AIs are subject to hallucination. So I'm not feeling a lot of confidence about the whole thing. So what do you think, Gus? What are we going to do about this? What is our, like, what are you actually working on AI today, particularly AI surveillance?
Well, so we're looking at AI in a number of levels. Like, for instance, we're looking at where's automation coming into the workplace? What are employers? How are they using AI to make decisions about employability? We're looking at the gig economy and the way that automated decision making is affecting people's livelihoods, or how creators are being affected by all of this. But we're also looking at AI and surveillance, and this is the one place where the tech bros admit that they're a little uncomfortable about the future. As much as the Silicon Valley investors don't want any rules on AI, because for them it would be communist to establish regulations, particularly because they say, oh, but China is going to be so much more powerful than us unless we focus on AI. They also say, but China's building AI to do surveillance. And they don't complete the sentence for themselves. Like, are they building AI to conduct surveillance? And the answer is, it's already happening. And as I said, there's the military, well, the defense sector is already terribly interested with the accumulation of data, such as the running of automated license plate and number plate recognition systems, and increasingly being used in domestic surveillance. But there's also this emerging defense tech industry coming out of Silicon Valley. You can say Palantir was one of the first of this generation of unicorns, of firms that do believe it's patriotic to build the type of technology that you would then sell to the Department of Defense, whereas Google previously would consider, or at least Google staff would consider, this to be unthinkable. That's changing now. And the defense tech industry, you have Anduril, who's the current one that everybody's excited about, because they build surveillance systems that monitor borders, and they build drones that monitor drones. We're seeing this militarization of tech happen at the same time as AI is terribly exciting, and that's not going to end well. That is the one that we're focusing a lot of our energies on right now, trying to figure out, how do you stop that? How do you stop the money from piling in to building that dystopia, while there's also money piling in to make sure that only the right people get hired? It is pretty dark and bleak out there when it comes to those aspects. Yeah.
That again is one of those things that actually, I have a question. Why are they all named after Tolkien?
Yeah, I know.
What is that?
I don't understand. Like, Palantir is such a dumb name. It's such a dumb name. Like, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, and I don't think they understand how dumb a name it is, because yes, it's these seeing balls, these orbs that can communicate at distance and whatnot, but it was literally taken over by the great evil. And so why would you try to name your company as a noble company, say, oh, we do good in the world, we're going to name ourselves after the tool that was used to create a perfect surveillance state within, across Middle Earth by the big baddie? I don't understand. But yeah, and same with Andrew.
I blame Sauron.
Well, the thing I was going to say before that actually is that this is another fundamental characteristic of computers, and it goes alongside the thing of it always being more expensive to curate and select and delete data, which is that it's always easier to build the system that surveils everything.
Yeah, but it also links to your other point, Wendy, that it's always going to be a little shit. It's always going to not be terribly good. And that's why, as much as these ideas return every 5 to 6 years, it's because they have to return because we kill them off. We're not that dumb as a society to allow these ideas to take root. And when they do, it's only because they do it in the shadows. It's only because AT&T has a secret agreement with the Department of Justice. It's only because the intelligence agencies have secretly tapped into undersea cables. They get away with it when they go beneath the radar until we are able to dig them out. But fundamentally, as a society, either we push back because from time to time legislatures do their jobs, or the courts do their jobs, but also these systems fail. That's why we don't go around quoting 1984 anymore. It's not because the argument got less convincing. It's because we've used it so many times against a system that eventually got built and eventually had to get replaced. Like Kenya right now is building its third ID card system in the last 6 years. And I got tired of calling the current one or the previous one or the one before that a bad idea. It's like, it's just governments have bad ideas. We just have to make sure they don't take root.
Well, on that optimistic note, we have reached the end of the hour. And I hate to stop now. I could go on like this for another couple of hours, but we just do an hour on our podcast. Maybe we ought to do one of those 3-hour podcasts. What do you think?
You want to be
Provide
Joe
the
Rogan?
coffee, yeah.
No, I don't want to be Joe Rogan. I don't need a haircut that bad.
In some of those 3-hour podcasts, he really does draw people out very well.
Yeah, that's true.
Well,
maybe we'll try one of these days.
There is such a too much of a good thing.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And
I'm just so glad to be here. I'm very grateful.
If you're an insomniac, 3-hour podcasts are great because by the time they end, you actually really are asleep and you don't wake up when it stops talking.
Well, since you said you were glad to be here, does that mean that you would be happy to return?
So if look, I'm going to listen. I'm going to continue listening, and I saw the list of people. I've listened to a number of your interviews, and I'm honored to be here. I really am. Like you interview fascinating people, fascinating stories, and if you think I have something more to say,
Count yourself.
I'm sure you have
fascinating people because we enjoyed having you here.
Yeah, this was a blast. Thanks so much.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.